afternoon, everybody. Well, as you can see, this is a Central European panel, so already there's chaos. And we'll try to keep it up. This is a drama in 2 acts. The first act is what I'm going to say now, which is essentially 3 claims and 3 questions for the panel. And then the second act will be a conversation with the whole panel. But since it's a drama, let me start with a prologue, which is that I know that in events like these, when an observer of Central Europe or Eastern Europe has been speaking, Adam Michnik is sometimes inclined to say, "You've heard the ichthyologist speaking. Now the fish will speak." So I just want to preempt that by saying that I'm a slightly odd kind of ichthyologist who at least has fins, or maybe a fish with ichthyologist's eyes. As I described in my book, The Magic Lantern, just to illustrate this, exactly 25 years ago, in 1989, I was in a coal mine, the Dimitrov coal mine in the town of Bytom in Upper Silesia, where there was an election rally for one of Solidarity's candidates for the first semi-free election in Eastern Europe for 40 years. The name of that candidate was Adam Michnik. And we were down there, actually in the mine, and Adam gave a barnstorming speech, and then suddenly the head of the Solidarity Union said, "Well, there's some kind of a writer guy here from England who seems to have written some sort of a book about Solidarność. Why don't you say something?" And thrust the microphone into my hand. And so I said 3 things. First of all, I said, as a completely independent observer of these events, I wanted to say that all the world's eyes were then trained on Poland, and particularly, of course, on Bytom and the Dimitrov coal mine. Secondly, that all the world admired Adam Michnik as a model of courage, integrity in the struggle against communism. And thirdly, I wanted to say, as a purely independent observer, that if they voted for Adam Michnik, the West would doubtless give Poland a lot more money. I have to tell you, this was the only election speech I've ever given in my life, but I'm not displeased with it. And by that I want to say that when I talk about these events, it's not simply as the ichthyologist. I was a spectateur engagé. There was no question which side my sympathy was with. And I actually think there's a way of political writing which in a sense is more honest than the kind of pretense of Olympian objectivity, which is the aspiration of, for example, the New York Times. It is more the style of George Orwell in The Homage to Catalonia, which in my view is the absolute model for the political writer. And Orwell says, look, of course I have my biases. Of course I'm partial. I'm going to try and get the facts right. I'm going to try and be fair to all sides. But my way of honesty is to tell you how partial I am, to tell you where I stand. And that's my view of political writing. And then Orwell went on, and you are most critical of your own side, as Orwell was in Homage to Catalonia. And that's also part of the Orwellian formula. So one thing I want to say is that actually, if you have a kind of romantic enthusiasm for a liberation movement, and you look back 25 years later, you can feel a little uncomfortable, right? So I feel I was just very lucky, because it could have been Fidel Castro, or the Khmer Rouge in their struggle against an unjust American war, or the Sandinistas, or a liberation movement in Africa, like my good friend Per Westberg, who was a great friend of Robert Mugabe. And 25 years later, you look back and you can feel somewhat uncomfortable. Now, I would say that we can look back 25 years later, and perhaps someone would like to disagree, someone in the audience, but I think we don't have to feel that kind of moral discomfort. I think most of our friends delivered on their promises. But all did not turn out as we hoped and planned. Okay, so what I want to do is now to look at the things we see more clearly 25 years on, including some things we didn't even see 5 years ago on the 20th anniversary of 1989. And following the first rule of journalism, first simplify, then exaggerate. So my three claims. Number one, 1989 is the new 1789. It has become the default model of revolution. So from 1789 through the 19th century, 1848, Paris Commune, 1970, the communist seizure of power, even up to the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the default model of revolution was 1789. It was a violent seizure of power. You stormed the Bastille, and then you had a dramatic radicalization. You went to the Jacobins from the Girondins, from the Mensheviks to the Bolsheviks. And I want to argue that since 1989, the default model of revolution has been the model of 1989, which, by the way, started before 1989. Remember the revolution of the Carnations in Portugal in 1974? Remember people power in the Philippines? But nonetheless, it was 89 which established a model of non-violent revolution in which you had mass mobilization, you had masses of people on the streets, you had 300,000 people on Wenceslas Square in Prague. But it did not turn to violence. Non-violent discipline was maintained, and in the end you used all that people power to make a negotiated transition at a round table, as happened in Poland 25 years ago. That's the Velvet Revolution model. And ever since, there have been numerous examples. I would say South Africa, I would say the fall of Milosevic in Serbia, Georgia, arguably the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Arab Spring at the beginning in Tunisia and Egypt, the beginnings of the current protests in Ukraine, the Euromaidan. All of those started with the 1989 model. They may not have finished with it, it may have gone wrong, but they started with it. So that's claim number one. 1989 is the new 1789. Claim number two. There was not just one 1989 whose consequences are still being played out today. There were three 1989s. The first 1989 is the one we're all here to talk about in Central and Eastern Europe, which resulted in the end of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Iron Curtain, the end of the Cold War, the end of the bipolar world, and many other consequences. The second 1989 was Tiananmen. It was the 4th of June, 1989, the very day of those semi-free elections at which Adam Michnik, amongst others, was elected to the Polish parliament. I will never forget coming back, Adam, to your offices at Gazeta Wyborcza, the election paper, which were then in a kindergarten, and seeing on a black and white television screen the first pictures of the dead being taken or carried away from Tiananmen Square. On the 3rd of June 1989, the Soviet world and the Chinese world was still in some sense in the same world, potentially on similar trajectories. On the 5th of June 1989, they were launched on completely different trajectories. And the Chinese 1989 brought us something that none of us dreamed of in 1989. In shorthand, first simplify then exaggerate, Leninist capitalism. A Leninist capitalism which this year will have enabled China to overtake the United States as the world's largest economy. So that's the second 1989. And the third 1989 occurred on the 14th of February 1989, Valentine's Day, and it was a fatwa delivered by Ayatollah Khomeini on Salman Rushdie, with whom I'll be talking in this festival tomorrow about free speech. And that 1989, that very dark 1989, also has consequences that have echoed down the last quarter century. Incidentally, all three of these 1989s have proximate causes that can be traced back to roughly 10 years before. And by the way, I'm delighted to see Salman Rushdie here with us today in the second row. So 78, 79, the Polish Pope was elected and makes his first massive pilgrimage to Poland. Millions of people turn out. For a week, the communist state virtually ceases to exist. Without that visit, no solidarity. Without solidarity, no 1989. In China, 78, 79, Deng Xiaoping and the beginning of his reforms, which lead directly on to what happened after 1989. And of course, 78, 79, in Iran, the Iranian Revolution made by the Islamist Leninist Ayatollah Khomeini, someone who, by the way, read and studied Lenin quite closely, which also leads to the third 1989. And I think when we talk about 1989, we have to think about and remember all those three 1989 and their consequences played out. Some people would add a fourth. Some people claim the internet was invented in 1989, but this is a somewhat risky claim. We could come back to that. My third claim is that the result of the first of those 1989s was an excruciating bout of Western hubris, something that often happens after a great and unexpected triumph. Hubris manifested at home in the wild excesses of globalized financial capitalism, which privatized massive profit and nationalized massive risk, a hubris that came home to roost starting roughly in 2008, 2009, Lehman Brothers on, whose consequences we're still seeing to this day. Hubris abroad in the Iraq War, which in a curious way had at least some small part of its imaginative inspiration from 1989, in two senses. Firstly, that there was a strong moral sense that if you can take down a brutal dictatorship, you should, which is one reason I know that my friend Adam Michnik and Václav Havel and others supported it, but also in the illusion shared by people like Paul Wolfowitz and many neocons that if you did it in Iraq, if you just pulled down the statue of Saddam, tore off the dictatorship, what would then come up would be a flourishing, pluralist, liberal democracy. And I would argue that in the back of people's minds there was somehow the image of '89 and what followed. I hope there's enough there to start debating about. Those are my three things. Now my three questions, and then I'm going to sit down and we'll move into Act 2. Question number one, where is Central Europe now? So, some of you will remember that most of us on this panel, many people, in 1989, were talking about Central Europe as opposed to Eastern Europe. One of the first essays I published in the New York Review of Books actually looked at the writings of György Konrád, Michnik, and Václav Havel, who is with us in spirit. It was called Does Central Europe Exist? Everyone was talking of Central Europe as against Eastern Europe. The State Department actually changed the name of its department to the Central European Department. And the Foreign Office, as a loyal little brother in London, then followed. Right? How often do you hear people talking about Central Europe now? Why? That is the question. I have two partial answers. One is because politically, I don't mean culturally and historically, I don't mean talking of Kafka and Musil, I don't mean talking about cultural history, but politically, Central Europe was instrumentalized. It was a Hungarian writer talked about Central Europe as ferry country, like the ferry that ferries you from one shore to the other. And Central Europe was to be the ferry that ferried countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary from the political east to the political west. Well, we got there. We reached the other bank. Mission accomplished. These countries are part of the European Union. They're part of the West now, so there's no need to talk about Central Europe in the same way. They can identify themselves in other ways. That's a good reason we're not talking about Central Europe. The bad reason is that several of these countries have gone such different routes since 1989 that it's hard to talk about them in the same breath. And the two most dramatic examples are Poland and Hungary. We have people on this panel to talk about them both. So, I don't know how many of you know, but the organizer of this festival who just introduced it is Hungarian. So he gave us the title for this panel. And the title is Broken Dreams. Without a question. Can't do that in Poland. Poland, it would be dreams come true. Maybe with a question. And this is partly because of the age-old contrast between Polish optimism and Hungarian pessimism. I always like to say that if pessimism were gold, Hungary would be Switzerland. But it's also because these two countries have actually gone very, very different ways. Poland, on the whole, has gone very well. I'll leave it to Adam and Elzbieta to talk about it in the discussion, but on the whole, it's a flourishing country, of course, with many problems, many inequalities, with a crazy right-wing nationalist party, but nothing like Hungary under Viktor Orban, which is not exactly a one-party state. That would not be fair. But it is almost a parody of a majoritarian democracy, which has systematically dismantled some of the key institutions of liberal pluralism, like the independence of the central bank, the independence of judges, the independence of the media, and many, many other elements over the last few years, and which, while in some sense appeasing a far-right extremist and at times explicitly anti-Semitic party called Jobbik, has actually encouraged and put wind into the sails of Jobbik, because that's what you do. If you appease the populist right, you give them votes. It's like the Conservatives in Britain, only more so. So that Hungary, if it were a candidate country for the European Union, would not be admitted. But once you're inside, you can do whatever you like. So that, I think, is something else we have to talk about. Central Europe doesn't exist because of these diverging trajectories. My second question follows immediately from that, and it's this. This being so, where is Europe? You'll remember that the great slogan of 1989 was, "The return to Europe." Europe was seen not just as a real existing body of institutions, but as a locus of values. Well, where is Europe now? Even inside the European Union, even inside established countries of the European Union, trust in the European Union itself is at an all-time low. In the European elections in a few weeks' time, anti-parties, populist parties of various kinds are going to garner a significant share of the vote. It has done almost nothing to support liberal, pluralist, democratic norms in Hungary. As I say, if Hungary had been a candidate country, it wouldn't have been admitted. And so whereas in the past we thought that there was a kind of clear line between the kinds of authoritarian or hybrid politics you had outside the European Union and the clearly democratic politics you had inside the European Union, today it's nothing like so clear. Today, Orban is halfway to Putinism. And by the way, Berlusconi was hardly a perfect model of liberal democracy either. A guy, well, never mind his private life, but a guy who controls both the three main public TV channels and the three main private television channels. That's not exactly how democracy is meant to work. So where is Europe? And where is Europe in relation to Ukraine? Ladies and gentlemen, I think in a way we should spend the whole of the rest of our time talking about Ukraine. Because what is happening in Ukraine is absolutely shocking. What is happening in Ukraine is a mixture of what's started to happen in Bosnia in the early 1990s, a touch of the old Soviet Union, and a touch of Europe before 1914, right? So paramilitary actions by mysterious groups, supported by mysterious outside powers, seizing buildings, setting fire to buildings, shooting mayors in the back. That's already going towards Bosnia. Soviet, in the accompaniment of violence by the big lie. The language of the Putin regime over these weeks has been something to behold. Says Mr. Lavrov, we are not intervening at all in eastern Ukraine. We don't have a single person in eastern Ukraine. America must stop intervening. Says Russia Today, the Ukrainian army must stop using violence in eastern Ukraine. So the Ukrainian army must stop attempting to restore order even in its own country. All violence, says Russia, must cease in a place where it is absolutely clear that the violence has been stirred up by Russia. I sense in the room there may not be total agreement on this, but I think it is something that we need all to be talking about. And the question is, where is Europe? Where is Europe? You may say, where is the United States? Well, forget about that. Where is Europe? This is in Europe, after all. Cities like Lugansk and Donetsk are in Europe. Where is Europe? Europe is perhaps best represented by the former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, who just celebrated his 70th birthday with a party thrown by Vladimir Putin in St. Petersburg. And some of you will have seen the picture of him giving a warm embrace and smack and kiss on both cheeks to Vladimir Putin. My last question, where are the 89ers? So in my lifetime, there have been two clear generations in Europe. The 68ers, 68, 68, and what I call the 39ers. That's to say, those whose life experience was absolutely shaped by the Second World War and its aftermath, and those who were shaped by the experience of 1968, many of whom went on, both those generations, the generation of György Konrád, the generation of Adam Michnik, went on to make the great changes of 1989. And my last question, given that 1989 was the greatest change in Europe since 1945, where are the 89ers? I think it's a question we should talk about in our discussion. My guess is that whereas the 39ers and the 68ers were the people who were active in 39 and after 39, and active in 68 and after 68, and are now in leading positions across Europe, my guess is, but I'd like to hear the others on this, my guess is that the 89ers are actually those who were born in 1989 and who are now 25 and who have grown up with the Europe created by the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Iron Curtain, who travel naturally as a matter of course between East and West, who study in Paris or in Oxford, in Berlin or in New York or in Toronto, but also are coming into the lives of their own countries. But I think the question is there, and one for us to discuss, where are the 89ers? Because what is for sure is that if we are going to have Europe still in 10 or 20 years' time, we need a new generation of Europeans. Not the terrible old board we see leading the parties in the campaigns for the European parliamentary elections, but a new generation of Europeans to tell a new story about Europe. Can that be the 89ers? Those are my three claims. Those are my three questions. And what we're now going to do is to move into Act 2 of this drama. And we're going to have brief responses from everyone on the panel. And I want to ask my colleagues on the panel to respond to any of the things I've said. Pick one or two. Feel free not to respond to them all, or feel free to ignore them totally. And then we're going to go into a discussion, and then we'll have time for question and answer from the audience. So thank you for Act 1. Act 2. I think we're going to go start with György Konrád. Good.
Thank you, Timothy. It was a good speech, and I did like the 3 points, the 89. Also, this 200-year bridge between the French Revolution and the collapse of the Soviet Empire. I approve the two other points, the Tiananmen Square and Iran. just today I remember on the Tiananmen Square story that it was a television crew behind me, around me, on the main square on the Heldenplatz, or Place of Heroes in Budapest, where 50,000 people came together, and it was the burial of the Prime Minister of the government in 56, Imre Nagy, who was sentenced to death and executed, hanged down, and buried in remote. Oh yes, louder. Yes. So on this day, it was somehow the birthday of this new republic in Hungary. And those who were sentenced to death and killed were reburied, and the negotiations started between the opposition and the ruling party, and it was made a quite democratic constitution without bloodshed. Let me give a compliment to my friend Adam. I was actually present in 1980 in Warsaw. I met him in a park, and he said with great gestures, incroyable, incroyable, he speaks French. It was incredible that he was invited to the university to give a speech, because before that day it was not possible. For me it was quite interesting. I was sitting on the stage and he spoke, and he didn't stutter. He stuttered in German. And he spoke fluent. But he said something very important, that they have to learn from the Hungarian Revolution, but not that it was a revolution which created many deaths. So the peaceful way of the democratic transition was an East European invention, East Central European. Why was it important to be Central European? Timothy made a joke that it's a quite Central European panel. I remember it was a Central European panel in Lisbon in 1988. And it was quite strange because Russian writers could come out from the Soviet Union and the Gorbachev time, and the Russian writers who were in the US, Brodsky, Dovlatov, Aksionov, and some other, could meet their colleagues, and of course they armed each other. It was a happy meeting, and they were always together in a happy mood. But it was a large and pluralistic World Congress of the Literature, and it was also a Central European panel where Danilo Kish, some writers from Czechoslovakia, some from the emigration were there together, me too. Péter Eszterházy from Hungary, some Austrians, and it was clear, Czesław Milosz also, and it was clear that the very existence of Central Europe means that these countries don't belong to the Soviet Empire, that they have their own fate, and they have to come out from this colonized situation, which was the creation of the Second World War, and what the West European countries didn't experience, they had the chance on the lucky side that the US liberated this part of Europe. The East Europeans didn't have this present, so their political system was modeled by the Soviet Union. And therefore, the West European countries did have 40-year advantage in the way to the democracy, and they were not somehow put in this situation where there is a pendulum movement between two possibility or two alternatives of these new democracies. One of them is a liberal pluralistic democracy. The other one is a, let's say, national or nationalist democracy, majoritarian democracy. I would not totally cut out the word democracy, because actually there are elections. And although the laws which regulate these elections, although there are all kinds of tricks and maneuvers, but they show something which is not very far from the reality, and it is the pendulum movement. 89 was a revolution. We could say that now we experience a kind of counter-revolution. If we would absolutely simplify, then we would say that 89 was red, 2010 in Hungary was white, in this sense. Wait a minute. But it is they say that it was a revolution, very funny. Revolution in the cabin, said Mr. Orbán. It means that in the cabin of the voters. But we are accustomed to an image of the revolution, many people on a big square. Here the lone citizen wanted Orbán. Why? There is also a desire of the order, or of the tyrant, or of some strong man who will say what is the reality, what is the truth, and what should we do. And this pendulum movement, people are, they hate already these strong men, and then they create a situation where there are many leaders. Nationalistic democracy means one leader. Liberal democracy means many leaders. Maybe those who need so much the order were disappointed that there are so many truths, so many possible aspects of the, of one issue, and the desire of the simplifying explanations are very good. In the case of Hungary, I would say all of these countries which can be have the name new democracies, or even all the European countries, they have two histories. One of them is the history of the allies, the democratic allies, the anti-Hitlerist, anti-fascist, anti-Nazi ally. The other is the cooperation and the collaboration with the Nazi, with the Third Reich. And those who are skillful enough now aren't proud on the collaboration, but they are proud on the resistance. And both are possible, both are there. In my country, there is a special situation. It was the last on the side of Hitler. So probably Hungarian soldiers fight it still on the last day. I had a colleague in the university who told me with very humoristic details this fight. I will not repeat it. This is a pressure on a nation to have a glorious history or to have a history which is very problematic, and maybe even people have to have a shame for it. The only nation in Europe is the German one, which could turn against his own history in the recent middle of the 20th century. They were not able to put the charge of all of these terrible deeds, but Germans and people under their influence did in the Second World War, including Holocaust. What I find that it is the supreme level of the National Socialism, but the National Socialism is also a very extreme form of the nationalism itself. I understand that there are people in all the East Central European countries also who have a kind of, maybe not nostalgia, but understanding and apology for the period where they were under the Nazi influence. And therefore, I as a writer, don't share so much a moralization of the history, in the sense that there are good parties, bad parties, good nations, bad nations, good periods, bad periods, good systems, bad systems, because there are people who try to live under different influences and powers, and they try to survive them. And it is a very difficult question, who was really good in this 20th century, which was a terrible century.
Thank you very much, György. So we have one point to talk about there, which is history. I'm very keen that we should try and start getting a discussion going. So Adam, would you like to come in and maybe just seize on a couple of points which you'd like us to talk about particularly?
Więc postawiłeś 3 pytania, a ja na nie udzielę 4 odpowiedzi.
You made 3 points and I'll try to give 4 answers to them.
Pierwsza odpowiedź jest taka, że z 3 powodów mam dyskomfort.
Well, the first answer is that for 3 reasons I feel very uncomfortable what was said here.
Pierwszy powód jest taki, że się jąkam.
First thing is that I stutter.
Drugi powód jest taki, że nie mówię po angielsku.
The other one is that I don't speak English.
A trzeci powód jest taki, że mówię po Timothy Gartonie Ashu.
And the third is that I have to speak after Timothy Garton Ash.
Dlatego, że Timothy w gruncie rzeczy dotknął wszystkich newralgicznych elementów tematu, który rozważamy.
The thing is that Timothy actually touched upon most of the most important things that we're going to discuss here.
Oczywiście, że nie ma centralnej Europy dzisiaj w tym rozumieniu, w jakim była przed 1989 rokiem.
Of course there is no Central Europe in the sense that we discussed it before 1989.
I próbą kontynuacji była idea Wyszehradu.
And the idea of Visegrad, the Visegrad Triangle, was a sort of a continuation of that.
Ona przegrała, ale nie do końca.
It was lost and compromised, but not to the 100% extent.
Natomiast nie mogę się zgodzić do końca z tym, co mówił mój przyjaciel György Konrád na temat centralnej i wschodniej Europy.
But I can't really agree on what my friend György Konrád said about the Central Europe.
W naszych krajach były, powiedziałbym, formacje bardziej nakierowane na dialog, na tolerancję, na human rights i mniej nakierowane.
I do believe there are certain factions in our country that were more or less oriented towards ideas like human rights.
I mówiąc metaforycznie, każdy z naszych krajów stał przed wyborem, w którą stronę chce iść.
And metaphorically speaking, each of those countries was facing the choice about the direction it was taking.
Przez długi czas symbolem tych Węgier niezależnych była osoba i twórczość Istvána Bibo.
For many years, the person of István Bibo was a personification of independent Hungary.
I myślę, że to był również bohater Viktora Orbána.
And I do believe he was also a hero of Viktor Orban's.
I to, co w tej chwili reprezentuje sobą Orbán, już nie mówię o Jobbiku, to jest pełne odrzucenie idei Istvána Bibo.
And what Orban became to represent is a total rejection of István Bibo, what he used to stand for.
Natomiast zgadzam się z tobą, że wszystkie nasze kraje mają problem z historią swoją.
But I do agree strongly that all our countries has a certain problem with history.
Mówiąc najbardziej metaforycznie, jest to problem, jak rozliczyć swoje relacje z faszyzmem, nie z niemieckim faszyzmem, ale z własnym narodowym.
Speaking on a most metaphorical level, it's about finding a relationship
Z narodowym faszyzmem.
To confront the national socialism, the fascism.
Znaczy nasz narodowy, nie niemiecki.
Not the German one, but the one that is within the nation.
W rozliczeniu niemieckiego faszyzmu my mamy już dużą wprawę.
I think when it comes to German fascism, we are really good at pointing out their problems.
Mamy problem z naszym polskim.
It's much bigger problem that we have with the fascism of our own.
I to samo dotyczy rozliczenia z komunizmem.
And the same goes to how we treat communism and how we try to evaluate this.
Mamy taką skłonność do wiary, że nasze narody, węgierski, czy polski, czy serbski, czy litewski, są chemicznie wolne od pokusy totalitarnych.
We have this strong belief that our nation, the Polish nation, the Hungarian nation, the Serbian nation, are organically free of the temptation of autorytaryzm.
Że jeżeli faszyzm, to musiał być w Polsce niemiecki, jeżeli komunizm, to musiał być rosyjski.
So if there was fascism in Poland, must have been a German one, and if there was a communism in Poland, must have been a Soviet one.
To jest bardzo niebezpieczne.
And it is very dangerous.
Dlatego, że to jest zła diagnoza choroby.
It's a very bad diagnosis for the illness that we're experiencing here.
Choroba źle zdiagnozowana rozwija się wewnątrz organizmu niezauważalnie.
And if you misdiagnose the illness, it really ruins the organism without being noticed.
Problemem, który jest dla mnie, dla Polaka ogromnie ważny, to jest pytanie o miejsce Kościoła katolickiego w dzisiejszej Polsce po 25 latach.
The question that is of extreme importance for me as a Pole is where does the Catholic Church stand in the political scene of the country after 25 years?
Timothy słusznie przypomniał wielką rolę Jana Pawła II i jego pierwszej pielgrzymki do Polski w 1979 roku.
It was a great point that Timothy made about the importance of John Paul II's first pilgrimage to his home country in 1979.
To było wtedy przesłanie w języku katolickim idei dialogu, tolerancji, praw człowieka i wolności dla wszystkich.
It was a message that was received in the language of the Catholic Church about the human rights, the tolerance, the universal freedom that was there to be had for everyone.
Dzisiaj Kościół katolicki nie mówi językiem miłosierdzia, tylko językiem anatemy, wykluczenia.
Today, the Church does not speak in the language of mercy and caritas. It speaks in the language of hatred and exclusion.
Najwyraźniej wielu naszych biskupów pozazdrościło irańskim ajatollahom i szuka swojego kandydata na Salmana Rushdie.
Apparently, many of our bishops are eager to find their own candidate for our own homegrown Salman Rushdie.
Na razie jeszcze nie chcą ich zabijać, ale ich chcą zakneblować.
Well, they don't want to kill them yet, but they're about to gag them.
I trzeba przyznać, że mają w tej materii niemałe sukcesy.
And we have to give it to them, and they were quite successful in the matter.
Następnym problemem, który mi się jawi jako ogromnie ważny, to jest miejsce korupcji w systemach nowych demokracji.
And another point that is of extreme importance to me is the place that the corruption takes in the systems of new democracies.
Otóż ta korupcja się staje nieusuwalnym składnikiem systemu politycznego.
In a way, this corruption is becoming the ever-present element of the political system.
Więc jeżeli jedną twarzą tej choroby europejskiej jest putinizm,
So if the Putinism is one visible face of this kind of corruption,
to drugą twarzą jest berlusconizm.
the other face that we're seeing is the Berlusconism.
I ten melanż Berlusconiego z Putinem to jest nasz europejski Molotow koktajl.
And this mix of Putin and Berlusconi is our own homegrown European Molotov's cocktail.
I wreszcie na koniec chcę nawiązać do tego, co Timothy mówił o Ukrainie.
Finally, I just want to pick up on what Timothy was talking about Ukraine.
Mnie się to wydaje zupełnie fundamentalne.
And I think it's absolutely fundamental.
Przez ostatnie 30 lat polityka zagraniczna Rosji była przewidywalna.
For the last 30 years, the foreign policies of the Russian state was pretty predictable.
Ona się mogła podobać albo nie podobać, ale mniej więcej można było przewidywać, co przywódcy kremlowscy uczynią.
Well, you could like it or not, but it was pretty predictable what the Kremlin leader is going to do sooner or later.
Ona dzisiaj przestała być przewidywalna.
Now it's not predictable at all.
Nikt nie jest w stanie, a już na pewno nie ja, przewidzieć, o czym dowiemy się jutro.
Nobody is able to predict, at least I am not able to predict whatever is going to be in the news tomorrow.
Czy Putin nie wyda rozkazu, żeby rosyjska armia wzięła w obronę rosyjskojęzycznych obywateli Ukrainy, czy tam nie wyśle czołgów?
We don't really know if Putin does not decide tomorrow to, as a protective move, to protect the Russian-speaking population, just to send tanks in there.
I mnie niepokoi, że reakcja Unii Europejskiej jest trochę taka, jaka by była reakcja Europy na Hitlera w 1938 roku.
And it bothers and concerns me that in the reaction we're seeing for the European Union and for the entire development is very much like what we've seen in 1938 with Europe reacting towards Hitler's moves.
Bo jeżeli Putin powtarza retorykę Hitlera, kiedy mówi o potrzebie obrony Niemców w Austrii czy w Czechosłowacji,
if we hear this rhetoric of protecting the German-speaking citizens of Austria, repeated of Czechoslovakia that we've heard in 1938, reused and recycled,
to kraje Unii Europejskiej powtarzają retorykę Chamberlaina i Daladiera, powtarzając swoje ustępstwa.
The European Union countries are basically following the lead of Chamberlain and Daladier in their refusal to take action.
My w Polsce mówimy tak, że Putin zajął Krym, a Unia Europejska zajęła stanowisko.
Well, in Poland we say that Putin took the Crimea and the European Union took a stand.
I my to traktujemy niezwykle serio.
And it's a very serious matter for us.
Może to wynika z naszej historii,
Maybe it has to do with our history.
ale kiedy my słyszymy, że to nie jest żadna agresja ze strony Rosji,
But when we hear this referred to as not being an aggressive act of aggression on behalf of Russia,
To sobie przypominamy dwie polskie anegdoty.
we recall two Polish stories of sorts.
Jak wojska chińskie weszły na teren Wietnamu, to Moskwa ogłosiła, że to agresja jest.
Well, the Chinese army entered the territory of Vietnam. Russia declared an invasion.
I wtedy w Polsce się mówiło, co to jest agresja.
And then Poles used to ask, what is aggression?
Agresja jest wtedy, kiedy jeden kraj napada na drugi kraj bez zgody Związku Radzieckiego.
Well, the aggression is when one country attacks another country without the explicit permission from the Soviet Union.
Druga anegdota była taka. Z kim graniczy Rosja?
And the second story was, who is bordering with Russia?
Odpowiedź, z kim chce?
And the answer was, Russia borders with whoever they wanted.
A z kim chce graniczyć?
Well, what do they want to be their border with?
Z nikim.
Nobody.
Dziękuję.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. That was terrific. I think we've got a few themes emerging. And what I'd like to do is to see if we can continue the conversation following some of these themes, so that we get some threads going through the conversation. So we have the presence of history, the politics of memory. A mutual Polish friend of ours likes to say that when Americans say, that's history, they mean it's totally irrelevant. Doesn't matter at all. When Poles say, that's history, they mean it's the most important thing there is. The theme of Putinismo, Berlusconismo, Orbanismo, all together, these new hybrid forms of politics, and the question of Ukraine and Russia, and above all the question that Adam put on the table, but which we have to try to answer, which is, what should Europe actually do about it? Now, Geert Mak has written a terrific book about Europe. Geert, I wonder if you'd like to answer, pick and choose, and maybe answer the last question.
I think your last question in your brilliant speech was, where is Europe? And I think that is indeed the big question now. After 89, and you said that too, and for me it was really, it struck me, we are in one of the big diseases of Europe was the hubris, the triumphalism. The Americans have their virus always coming up sometimes in their foreign policy, that this exceptionalism. We Europeans have our triumphalism. Slowly on, it becomes less, especially the last years, but the first years after 89, it was fantastic, but it was more and more also a problem. And I think, first, it was the expansion of Europe. For some countries, it was too late, much too late. For other countries, for instance, like Romania, Bulgaria, it was perhaps too fast, too early, but there was a mood of triumphalism. We can do it, and when it not succeeds, heaven will help it. The other field of triumphalism was the neglect of what happened for just common people in East European countries in the 90s, in this period between becoming member of the European Union and 89. And for a lot of families, like, now let's say, I traveled a lot, just like Timothy, in these former East European countries, and everybody was full of hope. But everybody expected also that it would happen within a second, within a year, 2 years, and then we would be the same as the people in Western Europe, and even perhaps as the people in America. That didn't happen. Even worse, a lot of families went through a very bad time. And I think that gave a deep underground, a fear of instability, and at the other end, a hanging for order and stark leaders, which is coming up every time now again. for instance, in Hungary, but you see it also in Poland, you see it. And you see it now, and that's the third part of this, let's say this triumphalism, that is the triumphalism of the organization and the triumphalism of the free market. And also the triumphalism was behind the too fast organizing of the euro. We all know the problems with the euro. The euro was in some way was not a well-organized, stable currency. And after the Greek default, all those problems came for everybody clear on the surface. And you see now in the southern Europe, you see the same tendency coming up. People who are longing for order, people who are afraid of instability. When you are poor, change and instability are dangerous, so is it felt. So I think with more than 60% unemployment in Spain, the same in Greece, in other countries, especially the youth is very hard hit. We will pay the same price in Southern Europe. And I think we are talking about Ukraine, and with right. But there is also a problem coming up, as a new kind of iron curtain sometimes. I have the ideas coming up between North and South. Not only between East and West, I think that is lesser since 1989, much more lesser. But now the iron curtain is coming up between North and South. What can Europe do? I think the next elections will be very important. I hope they will start a new discussion about Europe, and also about let's say, the spiritual values of Europe. Europe started as a spiritual project. We must never forget that. It was a peace project. I knew some of the people who started it, and they could really, people like Helmut Kohl in his youth, but also the people who worked together with Jean Monnet, they started really to cry when they started to talk about Europe. So emotional for them, because they were all physically part of the Second World War. So for them, at the end, it was a peace project. And somehow we have to get that feeling back, that's values. At the moment, I think these elections will also important because at the end, Europe is not only a market. And now, most of the politicians are talk only about figures, market, budget balance, and so on. And of course, it is very important. But I hope we can start. I think this election will be a shock for the European establishment, and I hope really it will give a change in mentality, because otherwise the project is gone.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad you brought in that dimension. 10 years ago, 3rd of May 2004, if you went to Warsaw, Prague, Budapest, Lisbon, Madrid, Athens, you had the sense these were all European cities where things were getting better and people were gradually coming together in the same Europe, and windows were thrown open and light was coming in through those windows. And go to those cities 10 years later, and it's a very, very different people. People feel that their fates are diverging rather than converging. Actually, Poland is rather an exception in this regard. So I think that's an important point. We still haven't answered the question what Europe should do about Ukraine, but Elzbieta is now going to answer that.
I need your solidarity, I need the audience solidarity, because to speak after Timothy Garton Ash, after Adam meeting, after my colleagues here, I mean, I'm not going to be able to answer your question. Let me just start with, when I came here in 1981, I do remember that came eventually the first sentence in my book. People ask me where I'm from, and as soon as I answer, they say, "Oh, Holland. How do you like it here?" Obviously, I didn't come from Holland. I came from Poland, but Poland was not on the map of regular people. Unless you were Polish American or whatever, they were not. It was not on the map of anybody here. So, I think that Central Europe appeared very interestingly and powerfully as as an act of defiance by writers, but really by writers, like people like György Konrád, and like you, and by of course, a famous Adam, you know what I'm talking about. I mean, you don't need to listen to that. You do remember the famous piece, Tragedy of Central Europe, which was written by Kundera, which really kind of put us on a map. So then if we fast forward to 1989, I think it was that sense that we are special, that we did something very special, that our revolution was different. And it was done by us. Nobody brought it to us. It was done by us and prepared carefully, thoroughly, you know, from 70s and 80s. And it was done in a normal way, kind of non-extraordinary way. Yes, it wasn't Molotov cocktails on one side, nor tanks on the other. So there was this idea that, yes, indeed, that theme appeared here before. We want to be like another normal country, and that's what this revolution was about. Return to normalcy, and return to Europe was that kind of return. It was return to something normal. Normal meaning, well, let me just leave. I would say we wanted to be like France, and we wanted to be like Italy, and we wanted to be like Austria. So when 1989 happened, we actually got it. We grew up our own Le Pens, and yes, we grew up our own Berlusconis and Haiders. But this is normality, this is normalcy. And yes, we have election and we have culture that works on that. The other thing what I wanted to say, which has to do with where Europe is now, yes, it's 10th anniversary of the accession of all our countries to the European Union, and it feels, you can go there and you feel it. It's kind of one space. What worries me, and what worried me in 2004, when that accession was happening, is that actually we were rebordering Europe. Somebody mentioned here, the Iron Curtain. It's a velvet curtain between us and Ukraine, but it is. And it is there, it's powerfully there, and it's soft, and it's kind of allows, it is give and take, but it's there. And I think we have to somewhat, something was done which was not done rightly. The one thing that I really wanted to return to is your concept of, the idea that it was this new paradigm which emerged in 1989, which changed really the way we think about revolutions. And I think this is perhaps the most amazing, the most extraordinary achievement of 1989, that revolutions did not have to bring major fundamental change. They did not have to be done in a violent way. And that imaginary, that new imaginary that things are possible, that you can do things that way without refraining to violence, was incredibly effective, and it traveled. That whole kind of imaginary of normalcy, that we also want to live in a normal country. Everybody wanted to live in a normal country with all the imperfections. And yes, you have to deal with Berlusconi, but with all the imperfections, and that traveling of that imaginary, and we saw it on the squares of not just Europe, but also south of Europe, where this is where the solidarity was. This is where people's solidarity was. So I think this is kind of important to remember, the only thing that didn't happen. And the only thing that didn't happen, and I think it was a lack of imagination on our part. Not maybe some people thought about it, but it really didn't work out, is that just as the French Revolution was talking about, it was freedom, freedom, fraternity, equality. 1989 was all about freedom. It was all about freedom. It was about rights, about political and civil rights, but it was not. And yes, fraternity was there, and fraternity, you can see it, and solidarity had a strong undercurrents of that, but it was not about equality. And I think that theme returns right now here, and I think it's something that is visible or becoming visible in Europe. Poland is lucky, but the transition was costly, and because it was triple transition, political organizations, institutions, democratic institutions had to be built. We had to, yes, the market economy took place, and we believe that market economy is the best solution. And then, of course, the constitutional culture had to be introduced. So it was a difficult transition, yet a painful transition. Yet I think the lack of imagination on the part of, well, of all of us there. I think perhaps Jacek Kuroń was the only person that I knew and loved, and I think that he thought about it and he really was trying to figure out how it could be done, but it wasn't. So now we are here, and whether it's New York or Prague or Warsaw, I think we do have to, and that's a legacy of 1989, to embrace not just freedom and not just fraternity, but also equality and social solidarity.
Thank you very much, Elzbieta. That was great. It seems to me that there's this, one of the problems is that we still somehow have in the back of our minds this ideal of the normal European country, but the empirical reality of what is normal across 30, 35, 40 countries in Europe is absolutely crazy. It's a madhouse. I mean, was it the Incredible String Band who had that song? Somebody help me. We Are Normal, in which a sort of wildly distorted madhouse voice kept the refrain, we are normal, but the person singing was obviously anything but normal. They were stark staring bonkers. Now, we're talking about 1989 and people power, so the people must have a chance to speak, but before we, and the microphones are ready, before we do that, I want to put our panel on the spot, including myself. Each of you, in 2 sentences and no more, 2 sentences and no more, what should Europe, in this case I mean the European Union, what should Europe do about Ukraine? Adam, 2 sentences, na więcej, 2 zdania. Ja, ty.
Pierwsze zdanie.
First sentence.
A twoje pytanie, gdzie jest dzisiaj Europa, to ja bym odpowiedział, że jest na Majdanie w Kijowie, bo to jest jedyne miejsce, gdzie pod sztandarem idei europejskiej setki tysięcy ludzi są gotowi stać i ginąć od kul snajperów.
Well, you ask us first, where is Europe now? I do believe that the...
I asked what should Europe do? Co Unia Europejska powinna zrobić?
To są 2 zdania, to
But
było
you said
dopiero
2 sentences,
pierwsze
that was
zdanie.
just first one. And, sorry. So where's Europe now? Now I think it's in Kiev, in Maidan, where thousands and hundreds of thousands of people are gathered under the banner of very European ideals, and they're ready to stand there and die for it.
A drugie zdanie jest następujące.
And here's my second sentence.
Unia Europejska powinna chronić Europę i powinna rozbudować jak najbliższe relacje ze Stanami Zjednoczonymi, bo konflikt europejsko-amerykański to jest bezpłatny prezent imieninowy na wspólne święto Putina i Schrödera.
Well, I think what should Union do? Union should really work very hard on collaborating with the United States, because the kind of the conflict we're seeing between the United States and Europe is like this birthday present for joint celebration of Putin and Schröder.
Thank you very much, Adam.
The gift.
2 sentences.
Yes, on short term, honestly, I don't almost know. It is very complicated. But I think on short term, building up the pressure very fast, much faster than now, by all kinds of economic measures. And I think also the other side, that is, I think, a mistake Europe makes too often. Don't promise too much. Don't promise things you cannot deliver. and on long term, reorganize the energy, build up very fast a defense independent of the United States. It is a wake-up call for Europe to organize things much better on, let's say, on a short, long term. So Europe has to work very, very hard. That must be the answer, because at the moment Europe is really weak in this situation.
Thank you very much. Good. Good.
Europe should speak in a sincere way. Europe shouldn't lie that we will take out Ukraine from the Russian oppression. Europe should avoid all kinds of military conflict with Russian troops. Europe should severely accuse all kinds of military steps coming from any side in these conflicts. The imperial nationalism of Russia is to accused. The nationalistic former minority nationalism of Ukrainians is also with severe skepticism to see. The different ethnic and territorial communities within Ukraine should have the freedom to organize themselves, to create some autonomous territories. If there will be a federalization of Ukraine, it's not bad. There are in Europe states which have a federal structure, and these are the least damageable structures. Let's see, Germany, Spain, Great Britain, and so on. So Europe should help offering this experience of creating democratic territorial unities, and Europe should have a clear side in the history in the special history of Central and Eastern European nations, which are not to analyzed with the same intellectual tools which were created in the past. These are not real national states, these unities which came out from the Soviet, and to push the Russian with the alternative energy, it means to take away the main weapon from Putin. It is the monopoly of the oil.
2 sentences. Europe and the United States ought to create quickly major Marshall Plan to support Ukrainian government, the various layers of Ukrainian society to help rebuild Ukraine, which was ruined in the last 25 years, more than ever. The second thing, Europe ought to lessen the velvet curtain. Europe has to initiate major exchanges, should invite students back and forth. There has to be bigger traffic between people and ideas. I know there was 2 sentences, one more thing. And it's a very long sentence, and it should lessen the curtain for students, but also for small trade to help Ukrainians to pick themselves up.
As a purely impartial chap, just if I may, György, I think the kind of federalism Vladimir Putin has in mind is not exactly Switzerland.
There are all kinds of federalisms.
Well, there's
different
also Bosnia. I mean, I think he has more in mind. Very, very.
It was not a great idea, Bosnia.
No, well, exactly so. I rest my case. My 2 sentences would be, first of all, that we should promise what we have spectacularly failed to promise for the last 10 years since the Orange Revolution, namely, if Ukraine fulfills the conditions, it should clearly be free to become a member of the European Union. That was one sentence. Second sentence, I believe what Russia has done in Ukraine is now so outrageous, so threatening to the whole way we conduct international relations, not just in Europe, but in the world, that we should now use the one instrument at our disposal in the European Union, which is not military, but economic, and really show Putin the instrument of economic torture right now. Use our economic strength right now, because the next 2 weeks will be absolutely decisive for the future of an independent Ukraine and therefore for the whole European order. That was the second sentence. Now, questions, comments from the floor. I'm going to collect them, please put your hand up if you want to ask a question. Lady in the front here, I think there's a microphone. If you'd like to come quickly to the microphone. We're going to collect a few questions or comments. If you can make them questions, please, and just give your name.
My name is Alice. I'm from Sweden. We are several nationalities, Danish, French, in front here, and we are a lot of Europeans. What is the common ground for our future? You were saying, telling a new story, you were saying the election is going to be a shock. We will have an election in Europe in 3 weeks' time. What will we expect coming out of it?
Is that a question to someone in one particular person?
Maybe to you and maybe to, sorry,
Geert Mak. Okay. Right.
maybe to you also.
Is there a question over here? Is there? Yes.
I wanted to, my name is Jenna Bushensi. I work at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And I wanted to raise the idea of international justice in Ukraine because the government of Ukraine has accepted jurisdiction of the court a week or two ago. And I wonder how you see that might play out in a way that could be useful. All of the European Union is inside the ICC, so this is also a way that Europe can try to support Ukraine. So I'd be interested in your views on that.
Is it to someone in particular?
Anyone who cares to answer this.
Anyone who cares to answer. Okay. Is there anyone else who would like to? Yes, please.
My name's Ken, and I would pose this to Konrad. In terms of, we talked about the economic issues and sanctions or whatever the case may be, but what about, given Penn World Voices Festival of International Literature, how do we think about our authors, our poets, our artists, with respect to the most seemingly intractable problems facing Central Europe?
Okay, I think we've got time for one more. Yes. Either way, your left or right.
I just wanted to introduce the element of it's a little bit different, but it's the Iraq War and the fact that the Iraq War produced a war awareness, especially in the U.S., which affects how Europe responds. And wouldn't a stronger response to that or resistance to that have made a difference today?
Right. Any more questions? Okay. Right. Now, one there. Yes. If you'd like just to shout, I think, if you would stand up and shout, would you mind?
Okay, I guess I could probably be called a uniter because I was born in 88. But I feel like one of the most overwhelming senses that many of my generation feel in terms of pondering the question for the uniters is a sense of sweet and utter precarity. And so in terms of maybe idealizing or organizing a common project, I'm just wondering how this incredibly salient and pervasive and overwhelming difficulty can be overcome and how that fits into the broader scheme of what we're doing in that.
Well, thank you very much. And if you'd allow me to guess, I think you might be somewhere near an 89er, give or take. And I think that was a very important voice, because you were talking about the precariousness of life, right? Someone coined the phrase the precariat. the precariat, which is now one meets all over the place in Europe. People, often graduates, who feel they have a very uncertain future, who feel their whole life is much, much more precarious than the baby boomers did or the 68ers did. So I think that's actually rather an important question to end on. I'm going to go back to the panel. So there was a question about justice in Ukraine, and there was a question about Iraq. Adam, do you want to take either of those?
Ja myślę, że jest pewną chorobą współczesnej debaty to, że kiedy jest mowa o Ukrainie, to słyszymy słowo Irak, albo Grenada, albo kontras w Nikaragui i tak dalej.
Well, it's kind of an illness that we observe in today's debate, that every time you mention the problem of Ukraine, the words like Grenada or Iraq or Contras come to mind.
Jak słusznie powiedziałeś, po dziennikarsku trzeba najpierw uprościć, a potem skomplikować.
Well, as you mentioned before, it's a very good rule of thumb to you simplify first and complicate it later.
Więc upraszczając.
So simplifying it.
Ameryka nie jest krajem bezgrzesznym i mógłby wiele krytycznych opinii wypowiedzieć na ten temat.
Well, America is not a political innocent in a way.
Ale,
and there's very strong opinion about it.
Ale nie ma żadnej symetrii między imperium amerykańskim a tym, czym było imperium sowieckie i tym, co próbuje teraz otworzyć Władimir Putin. Nie ma symetrii.
But there's no symmetry between the American empire and what the Russian empire used to be and what Vladimir Putin's trying to rebuild right now.
Ja chętnie wypowiem swoją opinię na temat nawet mojej własnej opinii, która była zdecydowanie prointerwencyjna w sprawie Iraku, ale tutaj rozmawiamy na inny temat.
Well, I'll be glad to give you my opinion about the Iraqi war, which I was very outspoken on the side of intervention, but that's not what we're discussing here.
Ja się zgadzam z Györym, że nie trzeba, czy nie powinna Europa dążyć do militarnej konfrontacji z Rosją.
I do agree with Yuri that Europe should not press towards the military confrontation with Moscow.
Rosja tego też nie chce.
And Russians don't want it either.
Rosja chce zająć Europę bez militarnej konfrontacji.
Russia is interested in overcoming Europe without any military confrontation.
Już Czurkin w Nowym Jorku, tu niedaleko stąd, ogłosił, że on się bardzo niepokoi z sytuacją rosyjskojęzycznej ludności w Estonii i na Łotwie.
Mr. Churkin, not too far away from here, recently mentioned that he's very concerned about the future of Russian-speaking minorities in Estonia
Łotwa.
and Latvia.
Więc oczywiście my w Polsce świetnie znamy to hasło francuskie z 1939 roku: nie będziemy umierać za Gdańsk.
We're very well familiar in Poland with this French slogan of 1939, we're not going to die for Danzig.
I żeby uniknąć militarnej konfrontacji, krok po kroku Hitler wszystko brał bez militarnej konfrontacji.
And on playing the sphere of military confrontation, Hitler was taking things step by step without even firing one shot.
Ja jednej rzeczy nie rozumiem.
There's one thing that I really don't understand.
Porywa się przedstawicieli Organizacji Bezpieczeństwa i Współpracy Europejskiej wysłanej, tej delegacji obserwatorów wysłanej do Kijowa.
I don't understand. There's people from official delegation of European Union being kidnapped in Ukraine.
Jaka jest reakcja na to? Angela Merkel telefonuje do Putina i dochodzą do wniosku, że to wszystko robi, żeby uniknąć przemocy.
Well, Angela Merkel calls Mr. Putin, and apparently she does everything in her power to avoid any confrontation.
My i tak mamy szczęście, że kanclerzem Niemiec jest Angela Merkel, bo ona jest z Niemiec wschodnich i ona wie, kto to jest Putin.
At least we are very lucky to have Miss Merkel as a head of German state, because she's originally from East Germany, and she understands very well who Mr. Putin is.
I ona teraz, że z Putinem nie całowała się usta w usta jak Schroeder.
At least she didn't French kiss Mr. Putin like Mr. Schroeder.
Ale ja chcę wiedzieć. Ja bym chciał wiedzieć, czy jeżeli wejdą ci, jak to nazywają, rosyjskojęzyczni patrioci, tak? Jestem powiedzieć, to my mówimy, a Putin mówi na patrioci, tam coś.
Well, if they're supposed to invade those, as they call them, Russian-speaking patriots.
Tak, w Estonii i w Łotwie. I tam zaczną zajmować budynki publiczne i przejmować czołgi i armaty, to wtedy znowu usłyszymy, że nie będziemy umierać za Łotwę i Estonię.
So what's going to happen? Say they start taking over the public buildings and the tanks and all this, and what we're going to hear that we don't want to die for Latvia and Estonia.
To po co do cholery jest NATO?
So why the hell have NATO in the first place?
W 1994 roku Anglia, Stany Zjednoczone i Rosja podpisały porozumienie, że za cenę likwidacji urządzeń nuklearnych w Ukrainie oni gwarantują integralność Ukrainy.
There was a pact signed in 1994 between among United States, UK, and Poland that in exchange for dismantling the nuclear installation in Ukraine, we will guarantee the safety of Ukraine.
W ramach gwarantowania tej integralności zajęli Krym, a teraz zajmują Donbas.
Well, what we see as a realization of this maintaining of integrity of Ukraine is that they took Crimea and they are about to take the Donbas.
A Putin mówi teraz, że to były niesprawiedliwe układy, a w Polsce są szkolone faszystowskie, ukraińskie bojówki wysłane na Majdan.
And what we're hearing is that it was a totally wrong and unjust pact that was signed, and that there is apparently militias being trained in Warsaw to be sent to Majdan.
My w Polsce mówimy, że Putin to jest taki facet, że jak mu się podaje rękę, to potem trzeba liczyć palce.
Well, we say in Poland that Mr. Putin is the kind of dude, if you shake hands with him, you better count your fingers after.
Can we finish on that fantastic note? I'm afraid we started as a Central European panel in improvisatory chaos. We're ending as a Central European panel in the sense that we've run terrifically over our time. That is entirely my fault, and nobody else's. But we have instructions to stop, so I apologize that we're not going to be able to respond to the rest of those questions, except in 1 or 2 sentences. György, are you capable, just in 1 or 2 sentences, of summarizing the mission of writers, artists, and their role in the European project? But literally in 1 or 2 sentences. A haiku.
The mission of writers to write their work. The mission of writers is not to be engaged politically in bloody conflicts on one side or the other. No frontier is worth of a human life.
That was a haiku. Geert, in 1 sentence, what comes after the European elections? What happens after the European elections? This was the question.
It was the question.
One of the questions. The general expectation is that there is not many people. There will not many voters. Support is going down and down for the European project. There will be more populist parties in the parliament, much more who anti-European parties. They can block a lot of measures and legislation. And honestly, I hope, together with the fact, with the possibility of a referendum in Great Britain, perhaps the British want to leave the euro even, that this whole thing will stir up a serious discussion about what shall we do with the European Union and how can we make parts of the Union stronger and perhaps also give back to nations and perhaps to the cities. Cities become more and more important. A lot of stuff which is yet arranged in Brussels. European Union is in fact a federation upside down, and we have to turn it around again.
Right. Yeah, but one second, if you like. You don't need to, if you like. That was absolutely eloquent. Well, so we've ended with Mr. Putin, who after you've shaken hands with him, you have to count the fingers on your hand, and the European Union being a construction upside down. And as you will see, there is no shortage of diversity of views on this panel as there is in Europe. Whether there are any really good answers to the question of what we do about Ukraine, whether there are any really persuasive answers to, I think, in a sense, the most important question of the evening, which is what are we offering the next generation, the members of the precariat, I'm not so sure. But anyway, that's where we are. There will be a book signing afterwards, at which we will all sit and be happy to sign our books. But meanwhile, thank you all for your patience and attention. Thank you to the whole panel.